Good afternoon and welcome to the Farnham Castle Intercultural Training webinar. The session this afternoon is focusing on entering the global matrix, intercultural matrix management. My name is Laura Mayo and I work as the Business Development Manager here within the Intercultural Training team. Also supporting this session we have Matthew McLachlan and the presenter David O'Donnell. Before we start the main session, just a few general housekeeping rules. Just to let you know, all microphones have been muted for the time being. However, as and when we get to the Q&A session, we will be able to unmute the microphone should you so wish. There is a question box that has been enabled, so what we will do is we will welcome you to ask questions. However, we will hold the questions until the end of the main session as we move into the Q&A. Should you have any technical issues during the session, Matthew McLachlan is online. So there's a contact number on this screen that you can contact now for any help, or I will talk you through the chat box next. As we go through the session, you may be asked to get involved from an interactive point of view. So just to highlight a few key tools that you can use during the session. The chat box that I've already mentioned, you'll see on the bottom right-hand corner here where I've highlighted. Should you wish to ask a question, as I say, we will hold until the end. You can type the questions here in this box and send it through to host and presenter. During the session, you will also be asked to use your pointer to give your opinions and thoughts on particular questions. Your pointer can be highlighted or found here. So if you simply click on it, and then drop it onto the screen like this, we can then see your response to the question. During the session, you may also be asked to get involved in writing on whiteboards. So again, what you need to do is select the text icon here, and then you can drop onto the screen and then re-click the text icon for everyone to view the text that you've written. So what I'd like to do now is hand you over to David O'Donnell, who will talk you through our session today, entering the global matrix, intercultural matrix management.
Very good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to what is a nice, complicated title to get you started. I'm hoping you're going to see that actually a lot of the things we're going to talk about today are quite simple. And that's why the objective is to, as it says there, give you a practical insight. What I'm going to try and do, those of you who are expecting lots of theory and quotes from books, I'm afraid you may be disappointed. Those of you who want to hear a little bit about things that have and haven't worked over the years, then hopefully I can fill you in on some of those areas. In terms of the key topics, we're going to start off with why matrix management? Why in the first place? Why are we doing it? Why don't we just stick to what we've always done? And then talk a little bit about, from my experience, what does work, but also hearing from you what doesn't work. What are the key issues that you face? And trying to see if we can find out some solutions. I'm then going to focus on 3 of the 6 key skills. In half an hour, we can't do everything, but we'll talk later about some of the extra areas we can cover at a later date. 2 of the key areas are influencing and direction versus direction. How do we use that? And how communication and the correct communication, taking ownership of communication, is key to the success. And then Laura and I will try and take some next steps and some questions at the end. As I've said, a lot of this is not from theory. I've had 30 years of, first of all, being part of intercultural groups, then leading them, and then for the last 12 years, working with companies to help them in this specific area of building communications. I've worked across about 40 different countries and with about 78 different nationalities. And there's no doubt no 2 are the same, no 2 issues are the same. But what I'm going to try and cover here are some key points that I found are common throughout dealing with each of these areas. If any of you come back later to the practical course we're also going to run, we'll talk about specific countries, nations and cultures. But here it's more about some of the general things. So let's start with why. What's happening out there? So the first thing you can see is, as stating the obvious, the business world is changing. We're having more virtual teams. There's less, fortunately, silo management. People are being asked and are acting in a broader way. And that's why we are quite rightly ending up with more matrices, more things happening out there. That also gives us, fortunately, more multicultural teams, people working across different environments in different areas. But as I said before, this throws up advantages and potential and actual challenges. Just a couple of advantages from the beginning that I've seen. I mean, first of all, we've got a greater pool of talent without any doubt. Any nation, the bigger you make the pool, the bigger you make the group, the more likely it is you'll find the right person to do the right job. And therefore, we can use the resources we have more effectively. I think also, if any of you love, and I will quite a bit of theory, that the famous Belbin theory, and we talk about the 8 roles in Belbin, the one that gets ignored quite often is the specialist. And why it gets ignored is because often none of us want to do it, or we can't find the right person. Therefore, the specialist is key. And the wider we make the team, the more likely it is that we find the specialists. And why are we all in business? In the end, it's to get better results. And all my experience so far tells me that, and what I've seen, that good, well-run, well-organized, well-led matrix teams do give the best result. So that's great. That's all good. What about the difficulties? What about the challenges? I've got a few ideas, but at this stage, I would like to hear from you. So what I'm going to do is put up a little whiteboard and ask you to go to your writing tool, the text tool, and maybe just put down in there over the next minute, just what you see as the key challenges. What are the key obstacles, difficulties that you see either from personal experience or from your organization in terms of running and working in effective matrix organizations? So just take a minute, have a think, and then write something on the board. Any problems, I'm sure Matthew can help you. That's great, thank you, and actually also quite refreshing, because I think I'm going to cover a lot of those as we go through, which is those of you who run these will always go, thank goodness for that. Just picking on one of those two that's here, the unclear lines report, absolutely, I'm going to touch on that in a second. Communication, totally key. The language is a barrier, and often we think that of the barrier of the recipient. We've got to make sure that we take responsibility for that as well. Cultural differences comes into that, bits of language. I'll come back and talk about that. The different values and priorities. I'm more going to talk that, if we have a little more time. And preconceptions, I think, is an important one. So thank you for all of those. I'll try and cover most of those. But if I haven't covered it, please do come back at the end in terms of the Q&A, and we'll talk a little further about that. Okay, so if we just go back to, it says the webinar, thank you. The disadvantages that I had, the potential challenges, I think several of you mentioned the control element and the two bosses and things like that. We're going to come on about that. There is the fact that we've got to give people direction, but we are less in control, so we've got to do more influencing. Several of you talked about communication, language, those areas. Absolutely. Again, the clarity of the message, if not the message itself, can be clearly lost. So how do we get that clarity back into it? Cultural needs you mentioned, and that can be language, that can be culture. Yes, how do we understand that? How do we work with those cultures? And then the two that I think a couple of you mentioned in here is yes, the different priorities, the potential clashes that we have between a line manager and a functional manager. How do we get around that? How do we deal with those? And again, I'm going to talk about that in a second. And that all relates back into who is my boss? Who do I actually report to? Who is most important for me? I'm going to give you, to start with a small strategy on that to look at, and two possible potential maps. Strategy one, and as most of us, and at the moment I'm based in the UK, so I'm taking the UK as the base. I'm sitting there, and I have somebody who reports to me in Poland, and I have somebody else who reports to me in Spain. There are two options, and in this first option, those two people do report directly to me, but for some functional and supporting things, they have indirects locally. That's option one. The other option that I have is to, even if they should be directly reporting to me, is to pass over that direct reporting to a local manager. And I take more of a indirect role in it, maybe through a function, but also through actually just delegating some of the responsibility for that individual locally. So that gives us those two options, one or two. What I would like you to do is to take that famous pointer up in the top left-hand corner there and just choose between the two. Which one of those do you think works best for you? Option one, where direct control, or option two? Thank you, Claire. That was good. Mm-hmm. But if you, anybody else like to, oh, you coming in? Ah, right, okay. Anybody else want to write a comment? That's all right. We've got to start, which is good, isn't it? I'd like, if possible, and you know, Mark and Matthew, you're the only two on that side. If you don't mind me asking you, Mark, I'll get Matthew to unblock your microphone. Why option one do you think works best for you? Just interested if you could just kind of let the group know that, if you don't mind.
I've had experience of that one. I can't see the other one working. It needs to work for an airline, and that's the way we had it structured. That's probably why, because I'm more comfortable with it.
Okay, that's good. Thank you for that, Mark. Could I then ask Felicity? You've gone for option two. Why option two?
I guess, yeah, a little bit like Mark. I've got kind of experience working with the other approach, and I do just think that face-to-face contact, you can't really compare it to anything else. So having a direct manager that you can actually see often makes a difference.
And Claire, could I ask you the same question, do you think? Claire there? No, we may be struggling with that content. Could I try Elma in that case? Could I try you?
Can you hear me?
I can hear you, Elma, and see you. Hello. Yes.
Now, the reason why I chose option two, that is because I've been used to work in this manner, actually having a lot of indirect reports that I have to work through. And I think it's, of course, very much depending on the structure of the company and the task. But it seems to me that you can, you very often have people who are reporting to somebody else, for example, a business line manager. I'm working in a staff function, and you might need to work project-wise with these people, and then use your influencing.
Great.
So I think that the question you asked is a little bit difficult to ask without knowing the context, to be honest.
Thank you very much for that, Elma. Thank you. And Claire, obviously, just Claire is just simply saying we work with teams who do not report to us, but we have to influence them. Yeah, I think I think if we can, and we talk about this, a lot of what we do is from the personal experience. Yeah. And that's the model we go. I've worked across both. Both have advantages, both have disadvantages. I have to say, in organizations that I've advised over the last few years, when possible, I've asked them and suggested they go to option 2. The reason I choose option 2 is really threefold. One, it's at the shorter line, and I always find the best communication lines, as everybody's ever told you from army backgrounds or whatever, the best communication is the shorter communication. That tends to work for me. Secondly is there tends to be a better understanding of the culture, so that you get around some of those boundaries you put up earlier, tend to be handled better in that way. And thirdly, I think to me is the most important, is that any action that takes place, any project you're working on, any objective that they're working against, has to be followed and supported by coaching. And I have tended to find, as a coach, the best coaching is face-to-face, not distance. So one of the things that we'll look at as we go through is, yes, sometimes, I think, Mark, you made a very good point here, in an organization where you have to work with one, we have to make it better. But if you can make option 2 work, in my experience, not necessarily right or wrong, but it does tend to give you the better results. But again, we can talk that in more detail. If we then go to how do we make it work, that was the top line, that's the strategy involved in it. How do we make it work? 6 key areas. And it would be impossible in another 10 minutes to cover all 6. So I'm actually just going to talk about the top 3 at the moment: influencing, empathy, and communication. And I'll take any questions on the other 3 at the end, and we can cover that in more detail. But it's those 3 I'd like to look at. And I'd like to start with the influencing part of it. I'm sure you've all seen the circle of influence and the concept of in the center things that you can control, things I can influence, and things I can neither influence or control. I think when you're running matrices, first of all, it's clearly defining not the middle one, but the outside one first. What is out of my control? We spend a lot of time chasing rainbows, trying to catch the butterfly, whatever you call it, thinking, are there things that I actually don't need to control? They can be managed better locally, they can be influenced, and almost take those out from the beginning. Then saying to yourself, okay, what do I control? How do I make sure I get some control? Are there objectives in place? Are there agreed protocol? As we talked about earlier, have I got clear responsibilities between what I do and the local management does? Or if I'm the local manager, what am I responsible for versus my colleague sitting 2,000 or 3,000 miles away? So have those agreed, what I can do to control. And then thinking about influence. How can I influence? What do I influence? It's understanding the other person's point of view. What do they need? What are they looking to gain out of it? And as you'd expect, we're looking to expand all of them constantly, but it really is concentrating on those 2 middle areas, but not chasing rainbows, as I said, making sure you don't go to the outside one. Then, when you start working with people, it's a combination of I think, 2 key things that you have to get right. First of all, you need to understand them. And there's though it's the starting point, it's not the only point. You need the empathy. You need to be able to understand them as individuals, their culture, all of those areas. That is no different for anything else. But what they're also expecting and looking for you to do is drive solutions through. Make sure there's success involved. And I just, surprisingly enough, call this the 4 Eds. And very, very quickly, there are situations you can think about. You don't need much empathy. You don't need much drive. You can think of other situations, coaching maybe, helping somebody with an issue where you need high empathy, not much drive. There are times when you have to be the leader. You have to drive from the front. And therefore, a little bit of empathy, but as Michael Schumacher would always say, he's never waved anybody past in his life. You do have to drive things through. But a lot of the time, it's high empathy, and high drive. And that's what we want to achieve in matrix management. We need to understand the needs of the people. What do they want? But we also have to show them leadership. We also have to show them that we are driving things through to make things happen. And we can get mixed up in the first three. It's number 4 that's absolutely key to the success. How do we do that? 2 things, really. Firstly, we understand them. We listen to them. I'm sure, again, you've seen the blinds of communication before. But, if the blinds are down, if we haven't got them engaged, if they don't want to listen to us, we're not going to get anywhere. The key thing is having those blinds open and driving it forward. To do that, 3 things, again, really. Understanding what their level of sensitivity is to the subject. Is it something they find easy to discuss, something they find difficult to discuss? Again, this goes back to it's easier to have a sensitive discussion face-to-face than it is at a distance. So if you are managing for a distance, number 1 automatically becomes more difficult. If they have no knowledge, again, if they are experts in it, you've got to use that knowledge. They have to be the specialists who use them, as Melvin would say, and bring their best team skill out of it. But if they haven't got it, you've got to build it. And again, the cultural awareness comes in here. There will be some people you will know who are in cultures where if they don't know something, they will tell you they don't know it. You know exactly where you stand and you can work with them. There are others where they won't be keen to let you know. They'll hide and hide it. You need to work with them. So the knowledge of the subject, their knowledge of the subject is something you need to go. Again, only by building up the empathy with them will you do that. And then when we do come forward with the drive, we've got to do it in an approach that's going to work. It's got to actually show that we know what we're talking about and that we are putting it in the language of the individual. So that's the building the empathy part. Again, the second part of that is listening. Again, I'm sure you've seen this before, and I'm sure you're sitting there going, oh, I never ignore people, I never pretend to listen, I never selectively listen. We all do. And the difficulty is in matrix management, we do have to, first of all, actively listen. It's a skill. We develop it. You have to take the note. And especially in the early stages of doing it, you've got to find out really what they want by empathizing and understanding with them. So those levels of listening, again, if we get more time to talk this, we can talk about specific examples, but it's that top of that. It's asking yourself the key question. If I'm involved in a project meeting, if I'm working them, am I genuinely actively listening to them and am I showing empathy towards them? Then, when you come to communicate, it's very, very easy to say that the communication is the listener's responsibility. No, it's not. It's us. A very simple statement. The lady said the man is attractive. Who's attractive, the lady or the man? You might sit there and go, well, the lady said the man's attractive. But actually, if I just put a little bit of punctuation in there, I can change the whole meaning of the sentence. So in the first example, the lady said the man is attractive. It's the lady. In the second one, the lady said, quote, the man is attractive. It's all about punctuation. It's all about emphasis. If we do not get that right, if we communicate with our team in a very bland way, the message could be completely different. And how does it apply to cultural communication? We just got to make sure that every message that we send out, everything that we communicate to them, we check. We check for understanding, not just of us, but how is the audience? I always say, if you're going to send out project team guidance, especially intercultural, find somebody local first, show it to them, talk it through with them in a way that will actually work. So, in brief summary of this brief session, I would suggest 5 tips. Number 1, if you can, get the direct reporting locally. It allows you at a distance to manage more effectively the projects, the ideas, and work with a local manager on how the individual develops. Secondly, as you go through here, and I think just as important is, once you've agreed the roles involved in it, clarify them. Put them down in writing. Make sure everybody is clear on how they're working together as a team, but also the role of the manager locally or the role of the distance manager. Thirdly, as much influence as you can. It's not all about control. It is about working with them, persuading them, and the key way to that, I think, is point 4, which is think and act, high empathy, but high drive as well. Empathize with them, show them you want to work with them, but show them that you are driving projects, driving teams forward. It's high E, high D, the big Ed that works through. And lastly, and I think key, and this comes back to the point that you all raised at the beginning, is clarify all communication. One poorly sent email can destroy all the good work you've done in a whole year. 2 words there: pause, clarify. Pause, clarify. Before you do anything, just think about it. I know that was brief. I hope it was quick, about 20, 25 minutes. I do hope it's given you a practical insight into it. I'm sure what I've given is a lot of top line, a lot of tips and hints. There's much more to be had. In terms of the full program that we're working on here, and Laura can give you more details on that, we're going to talk about why matrix management is the top one, but we're really going to get into more depth about communication, really understand what causes conflicts and how we manage them, a lot on the cultural awareness within that. So what causes those conflicts what cultural barriers and cultural opportunities can be brought into play there. Very, very much about self-awareness. So where are your strengths against these things? What are you good at? What are you not so good at? Because that is the starting point. And last, a personal action plan. Because above all other things, this is about you as a person, as an individual, leading and directing a team. So thank you for listening. I will take the questions obviously in a minute, but in the meantime, I'll hand you back to Laura. Thank you.
Great, David, thank you very much for taking us through a whistle-stop tour around matrix management. Just picking up on your last comment, just so people are aware, we are looking to introduce a taster session around matrix management in January. So should you wish to receive further details around that, please feel free to give me a call or drop me an email. So in terms of what happens now, if you would like to explore this subject area in more detail, or in fact would like to discuss with us any other core areas of expertise, you may hopefully be aware that we are intercultural training specialists. So in terms of core areas of expertise, I've simply listed these on this slide here. We do a lot of work around global mobility training, supporting individuals, couples, families who are relocating or going on assignment. We also do a lot of work around global leadership, cultural skills for business, language training, and also provide a lot of support to HR from a global strategic support perspective. So as I say, if you have any questions on how we can support you and your internal business, feel free to give us a call and let us know. In terms of the webinar, we are happy to offer any attendees a discount off the standard pricing of the next company training program. Thanks for attending the webinar. So in terms of next steps for this particular webinar, we will be sending out a copy of the slide deck. If you would like a link to the recording of the webinar, if you can again drop me an email or give me a call, we would be more than happy to share the recording with you. So today was the last of our 2013 webinar series, but delighted to say we are going to be launching a webinar series in 2014, which we will be advertising in our newsletter in January. So we would very much welcome you to join the series next year as well, and hope that you find them informative. So what I'd like to do now is thank you for joining, and I will now pass you to Matthew McLachlan, who will facilitate the Q&A session. Thank you.
Right, thank you. I do have a couple of questions here to put. The first one is to David. David, your question here is, in my role, influencing is key. How can we be more effective influencers in a matrix organization?
Thank you, Matthew. If I start with, it's first of all understanding. I get a bit of feedback here. Sorry, somebody's got their microphone on. Sorry, I was getting feedback. I was hearing my own voice. Bad enough for you, even worse for me, I think. Sorry, just going back to the question a second. Yeah, it's first of all what I get you to do is to draw out a map of the key contacts. So actually to plan out who it is who's involved in it. Then it's a case of saying, in each case, how do I understand their needs? What are they trying to achieve out of this project, out of objectives, out of overall? And then really taking some time before you start driving. So this is in the E phase as opposed to the D phase. Actually think about what actions am I going to take to influence them more. And we combine that with the culture. There's lots of more things to be built into that. But at the top line level, it is this mapping at the beginning that's so important in making this work. Hopefully that gives you at least a top line answer to that.
Okay, if the person who asked that question wanted to email us for a more detailed answer, please do so. The only other question I have at the moment is, going back to the slides you had on the strategy options, what happens if you don't have a choice about the direct reporting option? What if you only do option 1?
That's a really good question, and that actually goes back to, I think, to Mark's point, is that's the situation I think you said, Mark, you were in, and you may not be the one who's changing that. Again, it isn't that it's not going to work. It can be made to work. That the communication between you as the line manager over that distance, one of the first things you've got to make sure is that what your reportee is being told locally is in line with the way you want them to go. So I think that's point number 1. Secondly, you need to set up regular one-on-one sessions with them. Though they're part of a group, if they're directly reporting to you, you've got to find a way of making that communication work. If you can, at least once in a certain period, 12 months, 6 months, whatever it is, get to meet them face to face. There is no substitute for that in any way. But if you can't, find out the best level of communication, what works for them. Is it Skype? Skype is a good tool. It can be very effective. You can see the body language as well. Seeing the visual side of it is so important. So I would always say find a way that you can get the one-on-one communication going. And then finally, agree the development plans for the individual, agree how you're going to work with them, and then talk about how that is going to be supported locally. So if there is somebody in the organization, could be an HR, could be another line manager, who can help coach the individual, that makes a huge difference. Individual coaching, individual support is so key on making that happen. So again, we can go into more details on personal case studies, etc., but hopefully that's the top line answer.
Great, thanks David. I think that's the last of our questions at this time. If you do have questions that you would like to ask any of us as part of the team here outside of this webinar, hopefully you do have access to the contact details now, so feel free to get in touch as and when you can. So what I'd like to do now is close the session. Firstly, David, thank you very much for taking us through matrix management, and thank you everybody for joining, and we look forward to you to join our webinars in 2014. Many thanks and goodbye.